Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute of World Politics. Today we have a special guest. He's our visiting research fellow from Australia. He comes periodically, and that's how I became familiar with his work, David Archibald. At first, when he presented his findings, I felt I had no wherewithal, I'm not a hard scientist, to judge one way or another. What attracted me to David's work was scaremongering. I've never heard scaremongering of this kind at all. I only had heard global warming scaremongering. So I thought to myself, geez, maybe we should pay attention to something that does not exist in our scholarly universe anywhere because it is not allowed. And since in the West, academia, universities have always stood on freedom of speech, why not encourage David to develop this topic? I thought it was extremely interesting. Then I found out that the Royal Norwegian Academy recognized David's work as practically the first human being to have tied the activity of the sun to the climate on Earth. Even I, who's not a hard scientist, found the logic compelling. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the sun warms us up. If the sun does not operate as warmly, then I guess it won't be as warm. This seems logical and it seems pretty straightforward, yet such an assertion has met quite a bit of opposition. The climate does change. As a historian, I know that. There's some of it in David's book, Twilight of Abundance. I know that, for instance, in the 17th century, the Polish army crossed the Baltic Sea on ice to assist the Danes. That means the climate must have changed because I don't remember the Baltic freezing solid so that we could visit Denmark. Had it been the case, most of the population would have left when it was under communism. I learned when I was an undergraduate that Poland had Mediterranean climate and there was wine growing outside of Krakow. Geez, that would have been great. Had I been a child back then, it was significantly colder when I was growing up in Poland. So, in other words, even from my limited historical perspective, I knew that climate does change. What also attracted me to David's work was that here in this town, we're supposed to be prepared for every contingency. I have no knowledge about anybody in this town preparing himself comprehensively from a geostrategic point of view for global cooling. I don't care if global cooling doesn't happen. I mean, I'd rather things were warm because I'm always cold. I don't care, but I would like us to be prepared for such an eventuality. However, political correctness prevents us from preparing ourselves from a climate change that dares not speak its name. Ladies and gentlemen, we are prepared for global warming. We're not prepared for global cooling, and that's just bad statecraft. At any rate, without much more ado, I'd like to introduce David Archibald. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marek. The baby boomers, people like Marek and myself, enjoyed the most benign period in human history. The superpower nuclear standoff gave us 50 years of relative peace. We had cheap energy from inherent oversupply of oil. Grain supply grew faster than population growth, and we had the cheapest food that humanity's ever enjoyed. And the climate warmed due to the highest level of solar activity for 8,000 years. All those trends are now reversing. We are now in the twilight of that age of abundance. There is a tendency to think that tomorrow will be very much like today. But the world is changing under our feet for the worse, and the rate of change is accelerating. It is the responsibility of the community of this institute to think realistically about what the future holds for us, what our choices are, and the consequences of the different paths we might choose. Society has entrusted us with that role by virtue of our presence here. In that context, Twilight of Abundance can be considered to be a status report. It will be updated as events unfold. The book's beginnings were almost a decade ago in 2005. I was asked by another scientist to replicate the work of a German scientist on the role of the sun in climate. When I set out in climate science, I thought if I made it to the US Senate to give testimony or the like, that would be as far as I could ever hope to get, and I would be happy. Thanks to Myron Ebel of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, I made it to the US Senate in 2011 to give a lecture on climate in a Senate hearing room. Some progress in climate science was made on the way. I can summarise those findings thus. My generation has known a warm, giving sun, but the next will suffer a sun that is less giving, and the earth will be less fruitful. There will be less fruit from the fruited plain and fewer amber waves of grain. It was also in 2011 that I was introduced to Dr. Hodakevich here at the Institute and invited to give a lecture on climate. Marek kindly said that the Institute would take a lecture from me any time I was passing through Washington again. I couldn't keep giving the same lecture over and over again, but help came in the form of the Arab Spring. That brought up the fact that Egypt imports half its food, which is a situation that can only end in tears. That fact started me down a line of inquiry that became a lecture entitled The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. That lecture found a temporal form in this book. Who are those four horsemen? A severe solar-driven cooling is one. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we are going back to the climate of the early 19th century at best, or the climate of the late 17th century at worst. Here in the mid-latitudes of North America, growing conditions will move 300 miles south of where they currently are. The United States, on my estimations, will be producing 20% less grain by 2030, taking the United States out of the food export market. Grain prices will return to 19th century levels in constant dollar terms. The second horseman is the fact that a number of countries, but particularly those in the Middle East, are playing a big game of musical chairs. One day the music will stop and there won't be enough grain to feed everybody. That outcome will be brought forward by the climate-driven reduction in grain supply underway right now. The consequent population collapse will take the region back to the population levels of the Napoleonic era. Every grain importing country is at risk to some extent. As Yemen or Afghanistan or Egypt tip over into collapse due to starvation, there will be an immediate bidding war on world grain markets for whatever stocks are available, exacerbating the trend. For those people who haven't read this book, it will all be a big surprise when it happens. The third horseman is our energy supply, starting with oil. In short, the oil price has tripled over the last 10 years, But oil production hasn't responded to that price signal. It hasn't responded to the price signal because it can't. It is physically constrained by geology. Soon oil production will tip over in decline, and the price rise will resume and accelerate. We can solve our long-term energy supply problems by commercialising the thorium molten salt reactor. There are literally hundreds of designs for generating nuclear power, but thorium in a liquid salt is the safest with the least level of waste generation. Commercialising that reactor is absolutely necessary if we are going to maintain a high level of civilization going forward. The fourth horseman is the Pakistani nuclear bomb program. Not so much their current stockpile of about 100 completed weapons, but the fact that they keep on building more reactors for making weapons-grade plutonium. They have 3 operating and are currently building their 4th. This is a country with a literacy rate of 55% and frequent power blackouts. Let's not descend into cultural relativism by suggesting that they don't have their priorities right. The Pakistanis must really like making nuclear bombs. They will still be making nuclear bombs when they take their last breath and the country tips over into collapse. And then the completed stockpile will seek a new home, and then things might get really interesting. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse come from the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. The book of Revelation also warns of another beast. And I'll quote, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads." Ladies and gentlemen, what has 7 heads? The Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. In 2012, the number of members of that committee was reduced from 9 to 7, no doubt to properly align with biblical prophecy. And what is the 7-headed dragon going to do to disturb the peace of the world? They're going to invade Japanese territory and attempt to seize the Senkaku and Yaeyama Islands. There will be a slaughter of many innocent people. Why the Chinese want to do this doesn't matter. They have their reasons. But as Secretary of State John Kerry would say, it is a very 19th century sort of thing to do, and not suited to the proper conduct of the 21st century. What matters is our response. Well before the shooting starts, in the first instance, we should be boycotting China and all things Chinese. Deny them the cash flow that keeps them going. As a US naval officer said recently, the Chinese spent 90% of their time thinking of new and inventive ways to sink our ships and shoot down our planes. And when our ships and theirs are met on that great watery battleground in the Western Pacific, let it not be said that anybody in this room contributed to the funding of the Chinese war machine. To be completely morally virtuous, you have to make the effort required to make sure that nothing of Chinese origin ever enters your possession. If you slip in that regard, have momentary lapses in checking labels perhaps, you will contribute to the death of a Japanese or a Filipino or perhaps a US serviceman. When all our souls are weighed in the balance, those who boycotted China in 2014 will sit at the right hand of God, and those who persisted in feeding the beast will be cast into the outer darkness. Because to know what is required, but to not act, is to collude with this particular communist aggressor. It is easy to make the right choice in this matter, and you have to make it, and continually reaffirm that choice in your daily life. I am not the only one who thinks like this. Dante said that the darkest recesses of hell are reserved for those who remain neutral at a time of great moral crisis. This is our moral crisis. Do we abandon the Japanese and the Filipinos and abrogate our treaties with those peoples? Or do we stand fast and remain true to our word despite a momentary inconvenience? If we do not stand up to Chinese aggression, our civilization will enter one of the darker recesses of hell that Dante warned of. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse lecture is 240 slides long. We don't have time this afternoon to go through all those slides. But these slides, a fraction of them, will give you a flavour of it. Now, what you see here is a graph of Afghanistan's wheat production from 1960 up to about 2010. And the modern history of Afghanistan is written in its wheat statistics. Back in 1960, they produced about 2.2 million tonnes per annum, and there was very little in the way of imports. Then imports started accelerating in the mid-70s. The Russians came along and invaded, and things got bad in the second half of that period. But population growth didn't fall below 2%. The US got involved in 2001, tried to do some nation building. But let's see what the effect of population has been in that period. Back in 1960, there were about 9 million Afghans. And this is possibly the natural carrying capacity of the country, about 13 million people. They started importing wheat. Here's the Russians, their turn at running the country. Population didn't actually fall. It stayed at about 2% per annum, despite all the landmines and everything else that went on. The Taliban was here and the US involvement here. Now, you don't like people starving to death while you're trying to save them. So wheat imports increased and the population growth expanded. Their population growth rate is now 2.4% per annum, which is a doubling time of 29 years. So the US has been in Afghanistan for 13 years now, and their population should have gone up by close to 50%. In fact, it did. When the US got involved, there were about 21 million Afghans. There are now about 30 million Afghans. Now, the number of deaths of civilians in the conflict is possibly 15,000, with 2/3 of those killed by the Taliban. Actually, the rate of increase in number of Afghans in existence through birth, relative to deaths in the conflict, is 600 to 1. Now, the US is going to withdraw from Afghanistan, thankfully, this year. And who will keep paying for the grain that comes across the border in trucks from Pakistan as the population keeps growing? I think this country will soon tire of it. Afghanistan is set for a population collapse, which, if you look at animal models, may take it down to 10% of its current level. Because one thing that people do when they're starving is they run out into the countryside and eat the seed grain. Now, it's all very well in hindsight, but back in 2001, we could have thought about these matters, about who will pay to keep the Afghan body and soul together after this country leaves Afghanistan. But never mind. In the wider Middle East, in the MENA region, what you see here is a graph showing countries from west to east, Morocco in the west to Afghanistan in the east. The size of the bar is the population in millions. And the blue is the proportion of the population that's fed by domestic grain production, and this red is the balance of imported food. Now, everybody in this region imports grain. There's 500 million people in this graphic, and they produce enough food to feed 250 million. Now, it only takes one of these countries to tip over into starvation, and it'll have a domino effect on the region as people bid up the price of grain, and most of them won't be able to afford to import grain. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, where grain comes from. These are the world's major wheat exporters. There's the US here, Canada, the European Union, Australia. Funnily enough, they're all about as much the same in the size of their influence on the export market. Now you'd think that the European Union is a pretty good position. It is a net exporter of wheat, all things considered. But if we look at it this way, what this graphic shows is per capita grain consumption of wheat for these countries and regions. There's the European Union, there's the United States, Iran, Australia, Canada and Russia. And this is 2014 ending stocks over annual consumption. So these big exporters, Canada and Australia, take a lot of time to get the wheat from the silos out to these ports and taken away in ships. So it seems that they have high stocks. The United States, for some reason, and it may be because of the number of corn chips you eat here, has about half the per capita consumption of the civilised world up here, rest of the civilised world. But here's the European Union with a high per capita consumption, but very little in the way of stocks. It would only take one bad season across the continent to put the European Union and Europe into a very bad position. And where will they come to when they're looking for grain? Well, basically they'll come to the United States. This is US grain production and soybeans from 1960 up to 2010. Wheat production's remained much the same, but you can see the enormous increase in corn production over the period. And that's enough to feed about 1.2 billion vegetarians. There are 330 million people in the United States. Average per capita grain consumption is 630 kilos. Now, some of the other highest on the planet are Saudi Arabia with about 480. But everybody will come here begging for an allocation of this stuff. That's one geostrategic matter consideration to think of. And here's another. The US Department of Agriculture kindly provides GDP per capita data on most of the countries of the planet back to 1969. So what happens when you get some of that data and plot it up? What you see is the OECD countries with the United States and Japan and the EU 15 and Canada, all in a sort of a large group up here. There's the rest of the world, and nobody lives in this gap. Nobody. In fact, we'll reinforce that by having a look at it this way. If we plot all those other countries relative to the United States and keep the US as 100%, you can see there was one year here in the early 90s that Japan actually reached the GDP per capita of the United States, and everybody thought the Japs were going to overtake the world. But most of them, the rest of the OECD, keep it about 80% of the US GDP per capita level. And there's the rest of the world. Mexico has actually gone backwards. Now, most economists and most strategists think that a rising tide lifts all boats, that there will be a confluence of GDP per capita and standard of living around the world over time. But here's 40 years of data, 45 years of data that says it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened yet, and therefore it will not happen. And by the way, that's China down here, coming off a very low base relative to the rest of the world. Now let's look at South America, and that shows why this might be so. Here's a number of South American countries in the cone, GDP per capita since 1960. And you can see here, Bolivia is basically a long-term basket case. at about $1,000 per capita per annum. And Chile actually had a lower standard of living than Brazil back in the early 70s. And then Allende got overthrown by Pinochet. Allende shot himself with a .303 given to him by Fidel Castro. And Chile has never looked back. And why is this? Because they've got the best legal code in South America. If you make money in Chile, you're more likely to be able to keep some of it than in these other countries. In fact, we go on to Argentina. 100 years ago, Argentina's GDP per capita would have put it into the OECD. They had 80% of the US GDP per capita 100 years ago. And then some socialists got elected here in the early 20s, and they've just gone backwards ever since. They're now down to 30% of US GDP per capita, and that may not have bottomed out yet. Now, to keep this presentation topical, we'll now discuss Ukraine, Russia and Poland. From that same data set, plotting up GDP per capita since 1960. Here's the Ukraine down the bottom. Didn't fare well when communism fell apart in 1990. In fact, their standard of living is the same as it was 45 years ago. It may be the same as it was at the time of the Second World War. Here's Russia. Now Russia benefits from oil production at the rate of about 10 million barrels a day and a lot of natural gas production. It had initially a bad time here in the 90s when the oil price got as low as $11 a barrel at one stage. And a good part of this increase is possibly due to the oil price alone and not anything the country's doing. But here's Poland. Poland had one bad year after communism fell apart and then just took off. So from starting with a much lower GDP per capita than Russia, it's now at least 50% higher without any benefit from a natural resource endowment of oil and gas. So the Ukrainians are sort of now the Bolivians of Europe. Unless their culture changes, unless there's less corruption coming, they'll always be down at this level. And as oil prices rise, and that feeds through to the cost of producing food, their relative position will go further backwards. Now on to the climate outlook. I could give you a 100-slide presentation on climate, but we'll spare you and just give you one, which is a summary of the latest research into what is going to happen. Now my own research is based on solar cycle length, so I end up producing a very blocky sort of forecast in 10-year increments. But a friend of mine in Perth has done a very good paper, and he's come up with a solar forecast that agrees with my own, but he's got 120 times the resolution. So we can now get a monthly prediction, monthly, yearly, whatever it is, monthly prediction of what climate will do from here. And I've taken Whitestown, Indiana as representative of the Corn Belt. As you can see, there's a fairly good hindcast match with the historical record, which is the blue. And what it's showing here in the red is we'll have about a 0.6 degree centigrade decline to mid-2016. The rate of decline will slow down a little bit, then we'll plunge away to about 2045. And the impact on agriculture is possibly about a 8% decrease in production for every 1 degree centigrade decline in average annual temperature for the Corn Belt. And that's what will take the US out of export markets in 2030. Now a few slides on the Chinese situation. It was actually the nationalist Chinese who sent a trawler around on a tour of the South China Sea at about 1946. And it marked a 9-dashed line map of their claims, and their claims extend almost down to the equator. And this is one of the bases they built in the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands. They started out with some things that look like yurts on stilts here, then that got extended, and then a more permanent base was built. And they've got about half a dozen of these built so far in the South China Sea. What our friends the Filipinos have done, they've tried to counter base. And this is a World War II landing ship that they ran up on Second Thomas Reef to try and stake a claim to that submerged rock. And there's 11 Filipino commandos live on this. And there are 2 Chinese ships constantly circling this reef to stop anybody getting through to them and resupplying them. The Chinese, possibly as early as this year, will try to scrape the Filipinos off their rocks in the South China Sea. Now, we in the West aren't really aware of what goes on inside China as much as we might do. There are about 1,000 museums in China, and 150 of those are devoted to commemorating the Japanese invasion of the early 30s. And this is the one in Shenyang. And it's made in the form of a desk calendar. And you can see the bullet holes that they've represented in the desk calendar. And it's opened up to the 18th September 1931, which is the date the Japanese attacked. So, through these museums and their National Day of Humiliation, which is a public holiday, the Chinese keep picking at the scab on their psychic wound of the Japanese invasion to keep the wound fresh, to justify their actions in the next couple of years. And that's a taste of that presentation. If you want the whole thing, it's available on my faculty page. Now, Twilight of Abundance also has some good news. The question of which is more virtuous, socialism or conservatism, is answered in this book. The answer is in a chapter entitled Culture is Destiny. In short, socialism is an archaic and regressive behaviour that we left behind in evolutionary terms with the development of agriculture 10,000 years ago. It all has to do with the enormous effort needed to take human babies and infants through to adolescence. That led to group food pooling behaviour in our Paleolithic forebears. Everything was shared and nobody got ahead, no matter how hard they tried. It seems that our species was once hardwired for socialism. Fortunately, that group food pooling behaviour was superseded by storable surpluses from agriculture, and civilization blossomed thereafter. This was the beginning of private property, capital formation, division of labour, and all the other good things that led to the level of civilization we enjoy now. Thus, conservatism is a more evolved state than socialism. I commend that chapter to you. The theme of that chapter will be the basis of my next book, which is entitled The Facts of Life. Because Margaret Thatcher said the facts of life are conservative. That book will aim to be an instruction manual for civilization. Which brings me to the aim of this book. The main purpose of this book, Twilight of Abundance, is to prescribe the strategic energy plan that the United States should adopt. Because if we don't get energy right, we don't have much of a future as a civilization. In short, we should develop the thorium molten salt reactor for power generation. The coal we are currently burning for power generation should be used for making liquid fuels. Humanity has been given a perfect planet to inhabit. The proportion of ocean to land is just right to sustain a mild climate. Tectonic processes have brought to the surface ore bodies that contain all the elements we need for advanced civilization. And the atmosphere has the ideal thickness and composition. We were given enough fossil fuels to kick off modern civilization and show us what was possible. We were given the nuclear match to light the fire that will sustain that high level of civilization during the post-fossil fuel eternity. We lit that match, uranium-235, but haven't yet gone beyond burning the match. It is irresponsible of us not to move beyond uranium-235 to thorium, the nuclear fuel that is 600 times more abundant and safer, cheaper and cleaner. Our standard of living is directly proportional to how cheap and abundant we make our energy supply. Comparative advantage between nations will also be based on relative energy cost. All the problems that are coming towards us over the next score of years, mass starvation and population collapse, climate cooling, nuclear proliferation, Chinese aggression, will be compounded if our own energy costs are not as low as they could be. Books are powerful things, or they can be powerful things. With this mere £1 of paper, we might build synthetic fuel plants, tear down ethanol plants, tear down wind turbines, and on their ashes raise up the thorium burning nuclear power plants that will sustain civilization into the post-fossil fuel eternity. As Admiral Rickover said to the Minnesota State Medical Association almost 60 years ago, a century or even two is but a short span in the history of a great people. It is the responsibility of this generation of that great people to honour the generations who preceded us by preparing for the generations who will follow. Honour them, therefore. Read this book, note its portents, and let it be your guide to the troubled years ahead. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the boycott essentially of Chinese products by American citizens or just citizens at large. What would you say to the government policy that the United States has had since the Nixon administration to more or less have a symbiotic relationship with the Chinese, meaning they buy our T-bills and we import cheap crap from them?
I would make preparations to expropriate Chinese-owned property in the United States in the event of a Chinese attack on Japan, which triggers the mutual defence treaty we have with them. There's quite a few billions. I don't think we'd run the war at a profit, but at least get some of it back. Their intent is to attack people, mainly Japan, and they may draw in the United States. We are bound to protect, the United States is bound to come to the aid of the Japanese.
I guess my question was just more, how can you expect people to do something like that when the government is also a part of the problem? Specifically, the United States government is contributing to a problem that you're mentioning.
Well, you have to change your government. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. Barron's magazine came last weekend with this cover, $75 oil. This is a long-term projection based on North American energy independence, again, based on the fracking of natural gas and cooperation between Canada and Mexico and the United States. So it seems like some experts at least expect the price of oil to come down. I happen to spend nearly 30 years in the Foreign Service working on food and agriculture, and again, I'm curious also about the projection about why will the grain yields in the Midwest, why will they drop so sharply? I mean, what is behind? What are the specifics, that will cause, the grain prices? And finally, when I came to this presentation, I thought the most compelling case would be scarcity of water as far as resources, because water seems to be something that we're really short of, and with the growing population and so on. Could you please comment on that? And finally, do you also incorporate astrology in your analysis?
Okay, if I can remember from the beginning, on the subject of the oil price, the US started fracking about 2004 and it took off from about 2007. And currently the tight oil from natural gas, and places like the Barkin is about 2.6 million barrels a day. But the US still is a net importer of 5 million barrels a day. At $100 a barrel, that's $500 million a day that goes out the door as an effective tax on the US economy. Now, if you look at the rig counts on the EIA website, the number of rigs being utilised to drill oil wells has remained flat for the last 2 years, absolutely flat. And I have friends in the oil industry here, I try to do deals with them, but a lot of mid-ranking oil companies and some of the larger ones are laying off staff because they can't make money at this current oil price. If the oil price fell to $75 a barrel, all that tight oil drilling would cease. So I don't believe it. In fact, the opposite's going to happen. The tight oil boom in the United States possibly put off the oil price rise by about 2 or 3 years. From about 2015, supply will tip over and decline of about 1 million barrels per day per annum, and there'll be contraction. What was this? Climate, was it?
Yeah,
grain.
Why will grain yield drops
Okay.
in the Midwest?
Now, the climate did warm in the 20th century, and it goes up and down. We've had a plateau for the last 17 years of being flat. It's going to fall away. The chances are it'll go back to the early 19th century sort of levels, or perhaps late 17th century, bottoming out in 2045. I'm not the first person to predict this. It was actually the best prediction made of climate was by Libby and Pandolfi, two Californian researchers, in 1979 using tree ring data from redwoods from Kings Canyon. And they said there would be a slight rise up to the year 2000, then it'll tip over and decline, and we may have a cooling of 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, there was also a Finnish tree ring study in 2007 that, based on the about 500 or 600 years of Finnish tree ring data, projected a temperature drop which bottomed out in 2045. Now, the impact on agriculture is that the grain belts will move south. These days, corn production is optimised about the length of the growing season. So we have a 2,500 GDD corn is used in the corn belt. Now, what happened in 2013, there was a lot of wet weather at the planting time, and a lot of farmers got their 2,500 GDD grain and sent it back to the seed supplier and got 2,200 GDD grain because they knew they were going to have a shorter growing season. So they ended up producing about 7% less corn. What I see happening is we'll lose 2 weeks at the start and finish of the growing season, and we'll have a greater chance of frosts, and all those things will impact. Now, the corn belt is ideal for production because it's absolutely flat. It got scraped flat by the glaciers. As growing conditions move further south, you'll end up into more uneven country. The other aspect is that colder is drier, warmer is wetter, and it'll be a lot drier in the United States and other places like Brazil. East Africa is going to go in for a 20 or 30 year drought. There is a correlation between Lake Victoria lake level and solar activity. That's resumed since the early 70s. And it has happened before in the United States. There was a large Indian corn growing population in the Western Plains in the medieval warm period, and they all got wiped out in the Little Ice Age. And you see the remains of their villages today out in that plain. So what was the third thing? Water. Well, sort of water is ubiquitous. Now, the Israelis are now producing desalinated water at 52 cents a cubic metre. If you do the sums through on that, that means you can produce wheat at $300 a tonne. Now, they're using fossil fuels to power that. Now, wheat's currently about $330 a tonne. I can see it easily at $700 a tonne. So it may end up being that we desalinate seawater, especially if we have cheap nuclear power.
But the state of California is experiencing a severe drought, which is reinforcing your thesis.
I can't claim that one. California's had some very long droughts. There are lakes there, natural lakes. If you dive down into them, there are redwood stumps 20 or 30 feet down. So the climate has been drier, much drier, for long periods in the past in California. It's unwise to build up a population base based on expecting that climate conditions will continue as they have been for the last 50 years indefinitely. Because if California tips over back into a long decline, long drought, a lot of people will be leaving that state. Yes, oh sorry, I'll finish on astrology.
Astrology, the movement of the planets, does that have any play in projecting anything?
No, there is in climate, there is an impact on the climate, on the barycenter. The planets contribute about 1% of the mass of the solar system by virtue of the fact that they orbit in different sequences. The centre of mass of the solar system actually moves outside of the sun's surface at some stages during the solar cycle, and that does actually impact it. I helped a bloke called Jack Eddy get a paper published about 3 years ago on that subject. He was the first person to mathematically figure it out based on the ideal spring relationship. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your book, sir. But it is very difficult for me and my students in Russian Generation Next, to explain why life in the 21st century will be nasty for them and rubbish and so short. What do you think about Russian Your Next book? Maybe the young people of that country not be waiting for apocalypse, and maybe they will be living in a more optimistic future.
Well, a lot of the shortness of life in Russia is self-inflicted. The average life expectancy for a male in Russia is 54 years, mainly due to alcoholism. In terms of how it will pan out, I don't see Russia going too badly, depending upon how your legal code goes. As you saw from that graphic, the problem with post-communism is that the criminals are still running the place, their names change, but nothing else changes. Until you get rid of endemic corruption, it's going to be very difficult for life to get better in that part of the world, I believe. And I have visited there. I was once a consultant on the steelworks in Komsomolsk-na-Amur in Far East Russia. So I am aware of what it's like on the ground.
I invite you to my students
Yeah.
to see corruption, alcoholism, drug, and other things. And you find another picture.
Yeah.
I guess so.
Cool. Yes, sir.
If the volume of the Earth is 260 billion cubic miles, and all of history would use 50 cubic miles of oil, what's to think we've come close to finding a substantial percentage, and it really is just a marketing strategy and a political control strategy, that the idea that it's inherently limited on fossil fuel, versus the Russian theory that it's just a naturally generated liquid mineral, and they drill through granite to find it, whereas we feel we have to drill only where there's sedimentary rock. And hence, we've backed our dollar with OPEC oil, and we have a reason for wanting to maintain the perception that it's inherently scarce, and OPEC production has to continue to be a substantial part of global production, or else, backing to the dollar might kind of evaporate.
Yes, you can drill through granites and find oil if the oil has migrated into that granite. But all oil comes from a biological source, and all oils have a biological signature that you get from the spectrograph.
If there are oceans of methane on the moons of Saturn, then do we think all of the natural gas comes also from biological material?
No, you can get inorganic generation of methane, but that's a much simpler molecule. Yes, sir, at the back.
Going back to coal to liquids, I'm curious. I've heard that the processing is incredibly water intensive. Given that China already has significant water problems of its own, how could they be reasonably expected to have a massive coal to liquids program if they're already consuming 10 million barrels per day and expected to grow over the next coming decades?
That notion that coal to liquids process consumes a lot of water is put out by the lefties. It's not actually the case. If you look at how much water is required to produce a ton of grain, for instance, 1 ton of grain requires 1,000 tons of water, and that ton of grain will be worth $330. It's probably might be at worst 10 cubic meters of water for a barrel of oil, and you end up producing something worth $100. And as I said, you can desalinate at 50 cents a cubic meter. So the cost of water, if you want to desalinate in producing colder liquids, is minuscule in the scheme of things. Yes, Marek, I believe you had a question.
Also a comment, actually a comment instead of a question. China doesn't care much about human life, including Chinese life. If they need water, like the Pakistanis need resources to develop their nukes, they'll use water even to the detriment of their population. China does have horrific problems. That's number one. Number two, related, it is the Kuomintang which pioneered island hopping, meaning Taiwan. And it is very strange, but the government of Taiwan, even if it's run by the Laotians, the Liu-Chu, the natives, tends to work as far as the islands are concerned, not only the Spratlys, Parcel, but other islands, disputed islands, hand in glove with Beijing. Taipei was hand in glove. Even when they don't like each other, they have worked hand in glove. Second, I thank you for telling us about astrology, which was fun. I took history of astronomy when I was young and beautiful at San Francisco State, and our professor taught us the Assyrian and the Egyptian ways of calculating things, which were completely fascinating, but they had more than a whiff of magic in them. So, if you are interested, I would like to recommend Professor Malinowski, late Professor Malinowski of Oxford, wrote a book, Magic, Religion, Science, which shows the nexus between the three. Apparently, in the 20th century, to a large extent, there has been a disconnect between all of them, but in particular between religion and science. I can tell you 2 anecdotes, or 3. Let's keep it at 2 from Berserk. Professor Gunther Stent, one of America's leading microbiologists, like Professor Stent, complained bitterly to me that as a secular Jew from Germany, he never took religion or philosophy seriously until he retired, because that gave him enormous insight into his own work. Second professor, I forgot his name, but he got a Nobel Prize. He was a mathematician who worked on the particle accelerator. Well, he said that when he saw his work in action with atoms appearing and disappearing, he remembered from his childhood as a Christian, invisibilium omnium et visibilium, all things visible and invisible. So in Western civilization, religious imaginary is or has been or had been for a long time a part of the process of scientific inquiry. Now, my mom is a mathematician, my foster mom is a banker, my foster father was an optical engineer, and my father is a foundation engineer. I walk by their bookshelves and fall asleep. They do the same thing when we look at my history books. It's a great tragedy of the Western world that there is that kind of a disconnect. I'm not advocating prejudice, but whatever can inspire art scientists and whatever can give me a better insight, I lap up. I have learned to accept things that are not necessarily explicable in human terms. That doesn't make me a witch doctor. I'm still skeptical and use the scientific method. But that's why I find him, David Archibald, extremely inspiring, because he's not ashamed of certain things that simply don't fly in mainstream discourse. So long as he doesn't make him dress in a skirt and dance around, he's partly Aboriginal Australian. So I don't want to do that.
to agree abandoning ethanol as a fuel source. But could you please tell me why we should abandon wind as a fuel source, especially places like Syria? I don't know.
Wind, you may get...
Did I understand you that
Yep.
you abandon wind?
Well, to have any sort of impact, I think you'd have to cover about 30%. Well, to supply the US with energy, you'd actually have to cover 30% of the country. In that wind corridor up the middle from Texas north, that basically the whole thing would have to be covered. And it's not a place where any birds or bats could live. Now, you might think, well, we might take it at a smaller scale, like 1% of supply, but then it becomes meaningless anyway. And being intermittent, you'd have to have storage to make it usable, which would take 40% on the whole process. You lose 20% going into a storage system and 20% coming out. That increased the cost 40% or more. The life of the turbines, currently we're taking the industry's word on how long the turbines last, but there's a UK report that came out late last year that suggests the turbine life is only half of what the industry's claiming, and that throws the economics out. So it's not really a civilization saving sort of thing. Same with photovoltaics. Photovoltaics are actually a little burst of energy at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and you get it back as an intermittent dribble over 20 years at 20 cents a kilowatt hour. You can't build a civilization on that. Yes, sir.
Well, in the last few decades, we had such a breakthrough in data storage technology, and some think that the next real breakthrough will be energy or electricity storage technology. Something to store it as density as even gas in it, and that will make solar and other wind and renewables completely viable. Because even electricity generated from changes in tides could very much be stored for a period of time. It's all renewable.
Well, you wouldn't want to bet your civilization on the fact that someone might invent that technology. That's the only thing.
People are working at it.
Yeah. Now, any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about the advancement in exploration and extraction technologies, crude oil, and how that is changing the market, and why that can't help maintain or even increase production globally, in offshore mines particularly.
Well, there has been an advance starting from about 20 years ago. 3D seismic came along, and that was the big one that increased the strike rate of success. But there's only a limited volume of sedimentary rock that can hold oil. Most of the ocean bottoms are simply thin red mud. The ocean bottoms are highly oxidizing. It's only certain places we get deltas building out. If they build out fast enough and the carbon is taken down into the sedimentary column fast enough, you don't get oxidation, and it might actually end up producing oil. Now, it's one of those lectures that, if I do it in the right detail, would take half an hour. But you only have to look at how much oil companies are finding. The Seven Sisters, as they're now constituted, are now producing 20% less oil than they did 10 years ago. And that's basically all you need to know. Despite the oil price tripling, they're producing less oil. The only way they keep the reserves up is keep buying natural gas reserves and putting in their reserves as barrels of oil equivalent, which is 6,000 cubic feet per barrel of oil. Other than that, they're going backwards at a great rate. Yes, sir.
I'd like to see your advice on the bottom line here of this excellent presentation. I mean, the world is the world population expected to shrink to the Napoleonic era. That was 1 billion people.
No. That's just the Middle East itself.
Oh, just the Middle East.
Yeah.
And yet, what is going to happen to people in this country, for example? I mean, are people in this country expect to live a shorter life, to be more violent, or more, more nasty, short life? What does that actually mean? I mean,
well, I wrote the book about a year ago, actually when I finished the manuscript, and it's been in the hands of the publisher thereafter, including what the title ended up being. So I had no choice in the title. Now, how life will unfold here, it all depends upon how cheap you make your energy. Right at the moment, the grain and soybean production in the United States could feed 1.2 billion vegetarians. Now, that excess of production gets fed to pigs and chickens, and you have very cheap chicken meat at $4 a pound, whatever it is. That's 70% protein. Now, as the price of grain goes up, all those animals' price will increase, but right at the moment the US spends 10% of average weekly income is spent on food and 10% on energy, which is mostly petrol. I can see the petrol price doubling, or gasoline price doubling, and food price also. That'll go from 20% total to 40%. The people who will suffer will be the entertainment industry, I believe, because that basically will take the discretionary income away from those people. Only half of US food is cooked and consumed at home, for instance. Half the food budget is spent outside the house.
Stop eating out.
Yes, any other questions? We're all done then, Merrick.